Our next panelist to speak is Jeet Heer. Jeet is a cultural journalist and academic. He has written for many publications, just to name a few: National Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Literary Review of Canada, and the Guardian of UK. Jeet is also editor of many books, both as co-editor and contributing editor. I would refer you to read the bio in the program for the more detailed list of Jeet's publications. Personally, I like what Jeet wrote before I even knew his name. I was following people's response to the Two Asian issue online, and I noticed this entry, which is particularly well articulated, but I didn't pay attention to the name because you know how it is. There are so many people talking at the same time. And then I followed this link to this article, Too Brazen, and I loved what is written there. So I kind of registered the name of the author, Jeet Heer. And then when our School of Social Work put together this panel discussion, I began to hear words that the name Jeet Heer, in fact, belongs to a well-known journalist. Jeet is going to speak on the topic, the yellow press and the yellow peril, from the Hurst papers to Maclean's. With that, I give the following time to you, Jeet.
So I'm really grateful for this event. I've written quite a bit on this issue already, but there's a lot more to be said. And there's a lot also to learn. And every time I engage with people in talking about this issue, I learn things. So I think that's one of the benefits of the process that we're going through. I want to say that when we read an article, not just this article, but any article, we read it through the prism of our own experiences. So a lot of the people that read the Two Asian article were reading it through the experience of being students, being professors, or being parents, or just being ordinary citizens. And I had a sort of unique perspective on it because I was reading it partially through the prism of my own experience of being the former employee of Ken White. Now, Ken White is the publisher and editor-in-chief of Maclean's, and he's also a very notable figure in Canadian media culture. He's the founding editor of the National Post. He's also, interestingly, as a look at, a popular historian. He's written a biography of William Randolph Hearst, who was a major journalistic figure in the last century. And so Ken was the first person to hire me for a journalist job. He had hired me to be an associate editor at the National Post a decade ago. And he not only hired me, but he kept hiring me because I actually quit on him twice. On the first occasion because I had received a Fulbright and I went away for a year, and then he hired me back. And then for a variety of complicated reasons, I quit again and after a year, but he kept insisting that I write for him. So I'm going to be saying a lot of fairly critical things about Ken as a political figure, but I should acknowledge that he's not anyone I have any personal animus against. Quite the reverse. He's been quite good to me. So can we have the first... there's the man himself. This is Ken White. I like to call him the aptly named Ken White. And I'll just give a few sort of biographical bases. Born in 1960 to a Catholic family, which has a little bit of relevance. He went to university, but he dropped out, I think, in the first or second year and became a journalist. And then in 1986, he started writing for a magazine called the Alberta Report. Can we have the next slide? Now, the Alberta Report is probably not a publication most of you are familiar with. It was regionally based, and Ken worked there from 1986 to 1993 and became, in the last few years, the editor-in-chief. And there's a couple of things to say about the publication. One is that it had a very stridently right-wing politics. It was run by a man named Link Byfield, who said, we're rednecks, we're out of the closet, and we're proud. In some ways, it was a precursor to the reform movement. They were very strongly supported the politics of Preston Manning in the 1980s and 90s, had ideas of sort of Western separatism and also the need to create a new political conservative party. And they also had a sort of religious element. The Byfield family that owned the paper were very strident traditionalist Catholics of the sort that rejected Vatican II, and that this very much showed up in the magazine, along with other conservative political causes. I think actually for our purposes, this is an issue of Alberta Report that Ken had edited, and I think it's from 1991, but it's an interesting precursor because it says Viet Gang. It's about Vietnamese gangs, and when they get older and more established, it's going to be scary. They're going to make the triads look like Rotarians. So very scary Vietnamese out there. I just want you to note that the figure is masked because I'm going to return to that in a little bit. Can we have the next slide? Now, one of the things about the Alberta Report was that it was very strongly socially conservative, and especially on the issues of gay rights. And that's why I see that statement, "We're rednecks, we're out of the closet, and we're proud," is very ironic. So this is an article that appeared while Ken was an editor at the Alberta Report, and the name of the article is "The Wages of Orientation." I'll just quote a little bit of it. You can read the whole thing. "Nature can't negotiate. She only retaliates," runs the old saying. "In the case of active homosexuals, nature is retaliating with a vengeance." And a little bit further down at the end of the article, "Might not the homosexual problem simply, quote, die off if ordinary people wait long enough? It would be a mistake, quote, it would be a mistake to expect that," says Dr. Cameron. This Dr. Cameron is a doctor at the Family Research Council, a US evangelical right-wing group. And the quote goes on, "Look at their political strength. They are obsessed. They have enormous influence. And even if they are dying, they are recruiting as many of other people's children as they can before they go." So Ken left the Alberta Report in '93, and he was picked up by a very important patron. Can we have the next slide? Lord Black, Conrad Black, and especially also his wife, Lady Emile Black. Ken was hired by Lord Black to become the editor of Saturday Night, and Ken moved from Alberta to Toronto. And one of the interesting things about Conrad Black was that, which he and Ken have certain similarities in common, which might have drawn them together. One is a common love of history. Both have written popular biographies. But also there's a sort of interesting Catholic connection that Conrad Black at the National Post liked to hire his co-religionist, which is it's sort of interesting. But I think in the case of both men, the Catholicism was worn a bit more lightly than the Byfield family in Alberta. That when Ken moved from Alberta to Toronto, he downplayed or muted a lot of the social conservatism that he had originally started with. And the sort of article that we just quoted was not the type of thing he was interested in. And both at Saturday Night Magazine and later at the National Post, he would hire gay writers. I mean, there were issues. I remember in the early days of the National Post, there was actually a specific rule that you couldn't refer to gays as gays. You have to call them homosexuals or the homosexuals, as some of them like. But it was very muted. It was a more muted social conservatism, and in some ways you can see the movement of Ken White from Alberta to Toronto as similar as the movement of the Conservative Party of Harper from the sort of Alberta base to Toronto. That the Conservative Party is still socially conservative, but a lot of the sort of fire-breathing Preston Manning type conservatism has become muted on social issues, and they try to keep a bit more quiet about it. So this indicates a certain ideological evolution. Can we go to the next slide? So at the National Post, I just want to relay a sort of anecdote to indicate one example of Ken's editing style. I don't know how many people here know the story of Hurricane Reuben Carter, the African-American boxer. It was made into a movie in 1999. But just very briefly, he had been wrongfully convicted of murder in New Jersey in 1967 and had protested his innocence. And there was a movement which took 20 years, but after 20 years in jail, his case was revisited, and he was the courts released him, and the prosecution decided not to continue with a further prosecution. And then Hurricane Carter moved to Toronto. So in 1999, there's a movie coming up by Norman Jewison, called The Hurricane, starring, now who did it star? He's a very famous American actor. Does anyone know this? Denzel Washington, that's right. It's starring Denzel Washington. It was a very big deal. And so Ken read this article in an American magazine called The American Spectator, very right-wing American magazine. And the article argued that Hurricane Carter was wrongly released, that he was actually guilty of the crimes he had been charged with. And to give you an idea what the American, I'm sure none of you know what the American Spectator is, but it's the magazine that basically instigated all the sort of muckraking into Bill Clinton's sexual life. And they were the ones that unearthed Paula Jones. And they also, as in a further example, they did a hit piece on Anita Hill, the law professor who charged sexual harassment against Judge Clarence Thomas. And they said, quote, she was a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty. So this is a very tabloidy journal, but Ken read it and read this article, and he thought, well, maybe Hurricane Carter was guilty. So he assigned a writer there named Andy Lamy the task of investigating into the Carter story. And Andy Lamy went back and looked at the court transcripts and looked at everything, and he went to Ken and he said, it looks like the guy's innocent. And they'd already invested like a month of research time into this. And so Ken was like, and I know all this through Andy Lamy, but Ken was like, well, we still have to do something. Just write up the story, but do it as a mystery, like we don't know what happened. And so Andy wrote this like very long article, which 5,000 words, and the headline was on the front cover of the National Post, Reuben Hurricane Carter, killer or patsy, question mark. And then the subheadline was, Hollywood loves Hurricane Carter, but did he do it? And one of the things is that the nice things we have in this country are libel laws. So Mr. Carter was on the phone with the National Post, and immediately afterwards, I think in a day or two, they published an apology saying that, quote, the Post did not intend to suggest that Mr. Carter should have been found guilty. We apologize. In fact, to go back to the issue of apologies, I know that this apology is totally insincere. That's exactly what they wanted to suggest. That was the entire point and purpose of the article and the way the article was framed. But they apologized. But I mean, that's perhaps you can apologize to an individual, but can you apologize to a group? Is perhaps a philosophical question we should ask. Can we get the next slide? Ken, after the Conrad Black got into financial difficulties, which some of you may know about, and then he had to sell off the Post. Ken, under new ownership, Ken was let go, and then he spent a year or two working as an advisor to the New York Sun, which is a very conservative publication in America that was financed by various wealthy right-wingers, which lost money. And then Ken came back to Canada in 2005 and became an editor at Maclean's. And since then, he has sort of continued this sort of journalistic style. There's been a couple of articles that got attention. One was Mark Stein's piece on the future of Islam. Next slide. And then the most corrupt province in Canada, but Quebec. And then next slide. So, as I said, one of the interesting things about Ken is that he's also a sort of historian. And I think in some ways, when we look at his career, we can also he has sort of given us evidence of, what some of the thinking behind his sort of sensationalist journalism is. And he authored in 2008 a biography of William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was a famous American journalist of the late 19th and early 20th century, the sort of really one of the pivotal figures in the founding of tabloid journalism in America. And Ken's biography, in some ways, is one of these biographies that is also an autobiography. If we're talking in historiographical terms, one of the things about the book is that it's the most favorable biography of Hearst. That there's Hearst is a figure that's very controversial in American history as the sort of founder of tabloid journalism. Perhaps to indicate one reason why he's so controversial, I'll just, can we have the next slide? One of the things that the Hearst papers really focused on was the issue of the Yellow Peril. Especially the sort of West Coast papers that Hearst had. There's a lot of concern in the late 19th century that San Francisco was becoming too Asian, and that the Asian powers like Japan and China were on the rise even then. And the Hearst papers really had this figure, this is like a major sort of running theme in Hearst's publication. And I don't want to be too much of a sort of pedantic historian because this is a popular biography and it is actually a very lively read. But one of the interesting things is that Ken in this book doesn't engage with the sort of, the very real critique that people at the time had and continue to have with the sort of nature of Hearst's sensationalism and the sort of damage that it did. I think that perhaps, so I think that there's an interesting, when we're talking about these issues, it's perhaps useful to look at figures like Ken White. And I should add the proviso that I know many of the people at Maclean's, but I don't actually know the process by which the Two Asian article was written. And I don't even know, and I actually doubt if Ken was that involved with the publication of it. But it is also the case that Ken has a certain modus operandi, and he sets the tone for the publication. That's what the sort of publisher and editors do, and that the sort of tone that he has in Maclean's is consistent with the tone that was at the National Post and prior to the National Post at Alberta Report. There's a sort of continuity that we can see in his career. And this actually brings up the sort of final point, which if you can go back to the figure of the the Alberta Report cover with the Vietnamese gang member who's covered up, and it's a very dramatic cover. And actually, when I saw that, I was reminded of the fact that when I was working for him, I was like doing an article about the hackers. There's a long article that someone had submitted about hackers, and so we were searching, and it's kind of hard to do pictures of like hackers. So we had to go through like a whole bunch of files to look at it, and there was like one picture which Ken sent me, which was of like some hacker, which for some reason he was like dressed up in a hood and he had his face covered, and Ken said, like use that one, hooded faces are always scary, scary is good, like like hackers, as we all know, are like not really scary. I mean, they're scary if you don't want to lose your account, but like I could beat up a hacker, right? Like so it's interesting, so there's a self-conscious awareness that fear is important, and even hackers have to be physically fearsome, as do Vietnamese gang members. So that I think ties in with my own experiences.